So this merits the question then, at what point does the amount of poverty in a neighborhood or a school actually become an identifiable significant problem, something that seriously affects the school? Well, this brings us to something called the threshold point. And it's theorized that there is a threshold point regarding urban poverty, referring to a point in concentration of poverty beyond which most schools are simply unable to function effectively in terms of educating students. Usually that's around 35 to 40% of the school population. If a school has 35 to 40% of pupils living at or below the poverty line. Now, it's a pretty interesting way this concept was developed. Lewis et al. Came to this conclusion by examining and comparing measures of poverty status among students. So what they did was they looked at poverty-related characteristics of a neighborhood and then compared those characteristics to the average reading scores in grades 3 to 6 in the neighborhood. So you've got these poverty-related characteristics related to average reading scores for grades 3 to 6. So first of all, what did they mean by poverty-related characteristics? They were very, very specific. They referred to things like the percentage of welfare recipients in the neighborhood, rates of unemployment, rates of crime, percentage of abandoned housing in the neighborhood surrounding a school. These were what they identified as poverty-related characteristics of a neighborhood. And I think we can all agree that these are, in fact, poverty-related characteristics of a neighborhood. So then these characteristics were compared to how well the children of those neighborhoods did on national achievement tests in reading. So this study was done for several elementary schools across several districts. So it was not an isolated study involving a few schools in one area. And the results of their study showed that there appears to be what they called a threshold point regarding how many students in one school live in poverty and how well the students of the school as a whole are doing regarding academic achievement. In other words, once there's a certain percentage of students living in poverty, there's really no way, or it's extremely unlikely, that the school as a whole can have high achievement scores in reading. And what did they determine the average threshold point to be? About 35 to 40%, just under half a school population. And again, these results were pretty consistent across the board in Chicago, Cincinnati, Cleveland, Houston, Los Angeles, Milwaukee, Rochester, and a few other cities. And I quite appreciate the fact that the study was conducted in several cities and several neighborhoods, which makes it especially valuable because it means this study can be generalized. So the results are not just applicable to one specific area. And they concluded that some environments jeopardize the development of a child to the extent that a threshold level is crossed, beyond which there are frequently negative consequences for their academic achievement. Can intervention counteract and overcome some of the negative effects of unhealthy environments? Absolutely. But that is a social service issue, not an educational issue. And research has indicated that continuing to this problem, or that the students themselves often kind of reinforce each other in terms of resisting, demanding, and requirements, which in itself is not unusual, as peer groups do this all the time. They support and reinforce each other's behavior. Resistance theory is the concept that resistance to school is simply how lower status students are used to reacting to anything to do with education, and that this is supported by an oppositional peer life and reinforced by the media. So they have no interest in learning a traditional curriculum that marginalizes the knowledge they acquire and need as the working class. Some research has actually found that working class students have a tendency to resist participating in learning opportunities available to them in the typical public school. So generally, that in these lower income neighborhoods in urban areas with a high concentration of poverty, that's kind of like the youth culture that exists there. You just want nothing to do with school. You resist it. It's like trying to mix oil and water. And that it gets to the point that it really is like a knee-jerk reaction. It's just automatic. Some research was conducted regarding resistance theory in Australia as well. Robert Connell interviewed working class teenagers and their teachers and parents, and he also concluded that resistance is their main relation to school. It's simply how they're used to reacting to anything to do with school. Partly because their friends reinforce this. Partly because when they're in school, they're treated like children, yet their daily life outside of school, they're viewed more as adults. And it's just a knee-jerk reaction to power and authority. So this would suggest then that improving education for lower income students is dependent on developing a curriculum and teaching methods that are relevant to them in terms of their own experience, their own interests, and their personal knowledge. Unfortunately, one reaction has been for teachers at schools with a high percentage of lower status students to be more likely to lower standards when they have a lot of students not meeting them. And they often face outright pressure and suggestions, or even subtle suggestions from their principal to just raise marks. So, keeping in mind we're focusing on unequal student attainment, let's take a look at this issue from a completely different perspective, from the perspective of the upper class. In this course, we spend 99% of our time looking at how lower status students struggle in school, how their opportunities for learning are negatively affected and narrowed and limited due to several factors. So for once, and actually it'll be the only time, we're going to look at the other side of the coin, how the other half lives, who have the means to give their children the best possible start they can at the most expensive preschools that exist with every advantage you can think of. Every year in New York City, there is an absolute cutthroat competition to get one's child into the best preschool possible. Yes, I said preschool, not even kindergarten, and yes, I said cutthroat. Because that is how seriously some people take this. Feeder schools. The idea that attending one particular school will dramatically affect where you end up going to school in the future, and thus affecting your whole future in every way. So this is feeder school theory. And yes, they even focus on preschools. Is there a certain truth to this idea? Absolutely there is, but how much truth? The achievement gap between students of different statuses continues, in part because even though lower income students have been provided more and more assistance, the middle and upper class have continued to benefit from more and more advantage. As disadvantaged youth have attained more education, so have middle and upper class youth. So I want you to follow the link to, not Netflix, follow the link to YouTube and watch this in full. And then I'm going to have you come back and I want to introduce one more concept to you. Having watched Nursery University and been amazed at all the opportunities these little kids have available to them. This really helps to demonstrate how the middle and upper status students and families continue to maintain their advantage. Everything that's been put in place, let's say just in the last 100 years for disadvantaged students, but we still have educational inequality. Why? Because of maximally maintained inequality, which means as access to one level or one kind of education becomes universal, privileged groups then pursue the next level. As I've said before, it used to be that high school was relatively rare. Only a very small group of people ever expected their children to graduate from high school, but then that became the norm in the 60s. And then middle and upper class kids began to as the norm, send their kids to college. And then it was university for a 3-year degree. And then it was university for a 4-year degree. And now some kind of postgraduate work is the absolute norm for middle and upper status families. We can also relate this to university admission. Remember, I talked about the pushing down of less affluent students in the US because the cost of university has risen so much. And in the States, there's such huge tuition differences between the Ivy League and state schools. They have a real hierarchy in the post-secondary system. Well, we can even see maximally maintained inequality going all the way back to preschool when kids are 3 and 4 years old. They're not even completely toilet trained, some of them. And we already see this maximally maintained inequality with what they have available to them. So what this class has done is really tried to look at unequal student attainment, why a student's academic achievement differs based on very, very specific characteristics. And sometimes it's, I think because I focus on lower income, high poverty neighborhoods so much, that it's actually more effective to show you how the other half lives and everything they have available to them. And, it's just amazing. Obviously I've watched Nursery University more than once. And when I watch it, I always think that of all the parents that are in it, that for me, the parents who truly, truly realize and appreciate the advantage getting into a good preschool can give their kids is the bartender and his wife, because they don't come from upper status families. And if anybody appreciates the advantage going to this higher status preschool could truly, truly provide their kid, it's them. So I hope you enjoy the documentary. And as always, if you have any questions, just shoot me an email and let me know.